welcome to the Manila Times. Make it safer, that is the call of bikers in Makati's Central Business District. Make it Makati, a collaboration between the local government and Ayala Land Corporation, have postponed the plan to convert protected bike lanes into sharrows or shared lanes. This so-called shared lanes means significantly less protection to bikers and other active transport users, as this would mean they would have to risk squeezing in between the gaps of huge vehicles such as buses and other motor vehicles. Several protests have been conducted this week by cyclists and advocates, which resulted in the postponement of the conversion to March 6. Here to tell us more is cycling advocate from Move as One Coalition, Anthony Siy. Welcome to the Manila Times.
There were protests against the Makati local government because recently, not barely a week has passed when they released the announcement that they will be converting bike lanes into sharrow lanes or shared lanes. So the bikers will have to share their lanes with public utility vehicles like taxis and buses to better serve more commuters. So this was met with disapproval by a lot of bikers and cycling community. So there were two protests, one last Sunday, February 12th, and then again on February 15th, the day they were supposed to convert those bike lanes. And then you sort of like went there, all the cyclists went there on the day it was supposed to change. So why were you protesting against it? What's the danger of converting those bike lanes to shared lanes? What's wrong with sharing it with other motorists?
I think, Ezra, one point to make here really is that Ayala Land, when they originally communicated that they were going to remove the protection of the bike lanes for the sake of public transport commuters, they basically said something about how with increased public transport approved vehicles, they were going to basically remove the bike lanes to create space for public transport commuters. Now, those of us who were there, I think this is a point we wanted to dispute really, because when they talked about converting the protected bike lanes to sharrows originally, in practice, what they were going to do was they were going to make it the same as any other general travel lane. There's nothing special about the lane that it would have become without the protected bike lane. It was going to be an ordinary vehicle lane, ordinary car lane, basically. This means that not only will you mix cyclists together with motor vehicles, which, as we all know, creates a lot of safety issues because they're traveling at different speeds from cars and buses. It's in protecting cyclists with physical protection is, of course, best practice you see in many places. But I think one thing we also wanted to point out was that by converting it to a general car lane, they weren't actually helping public transport commuters very much at all, because the public transport vehicles that would be using that lane would also be subject to motor vehicle congestion because of the cars that would use it as well. So this is something that in our view did not benefit cyclists and did not also benefit public transport commuters.
I see. So going back to what you said, let's go deeper on the safety issues that you mentioned. So what are the safety issues related to biking and traveling with other vehicles such as buses and private vehicles and motorcycles? So what's the danger in that?
So, Ezra, I would say that maybe one of the ways to start thinking about this question is maybe if you or any of the viewers could ask yourself, why don't you already bike to work every day? And I think one of the top answers they would give really is the fear that they would be involved in a motor vehicle collision, that a car or a bus would drive into them, and there would be generally not very much protection. The biker does not pose much of a danger to somebody in a car, but somebody on a motor vehicle poses a lot of danger to somebody on a bicycle. So really, when you talk about the need for physical separation of cyclists, it's the same reason behind why you need to give pedestrians their own space to walk, whether it's a sidewalk or a car-free street that's away from motor vehicles, because motor vehicles really pose a lot of danger to road users who are traveling on foot or by bicycle.
So you mentioned there's a need for physical separation of bikers from other vehicles. Is that correct?
That's correct.
But going back, we didn't really have bike lanes before. So there were already cyclists even before it was a thing. I remember there was a significant increase of cyclists around the time of the pandemic. So they were cooped up at home, so they'd rather just bike to everywhere to get out of the house. So what's the difference of before and now?
I would say, Ezra, one of the things we saw during the pandemic, you're right. During the pandemic, because other forms of physical activity like playing basketball, which we Filipinos love, that was not allowed during the pandemic. So many people turned to activities such as cycling for recreation and exercise, which were allowed. But I think more importantly for this discussion, because public transport was also suspended for a long period of time, you still had a lot of essential workers, people working in hospitals, in grocery stores, who still had to get to work somehow. And for them, the bicycle became a very effective and really important tool to help them get to work every day. And part of supporting that during the pandemic was the establishment of these protected bike lanes so that they'd also have space on the road where they could get to work safely and back. And I think over the course of the pandemic, it's been very, very helpful to many workers, not just those in essential industries. And in other countries, you see, in many other cities, there have been moves that to convert to permanent bike lanes, the protected bike lanes that were established originally temporarily have been made permanent in many parts of the world. Unlike in the Philippines, where you haven't seen so much of that, and I think one of the examples here is that you have a protected bike lane in Makati that's still being very heavily used by all types of cyclists, including those who go to work every day, now being removed for no real benefit, I think.
A few months ago, there was even a day, the government celebrated the Bikers Day. So over 500 kilometers of bike lanes have been constructed all over the country. That was the move of the government to encourage active transport in the Philippines. So would you say this move by the Ayala Corporation goes against the government efforts of promoting active transport?
I certainly think so. I think this is contrary to everything the government's been doing with regards to promoting active transport. If you look at what the Department of Transportation is doing, I think they deserve a lot of commendation for continuing to establish protected bike lanes even now. I know they've budgeted not just for protected bike lanes, but for establishing bike parking. So as far as broader government policy, there's still a strong commitment from the government to keep establishing active transport facilities, because these are used not just by people on bicycles, but even for e-bikes, which have become popular for people with disabilities. I think that's also really important when you talk about the inclusive effects of bike lanes. And I think what Ayala Land is doing by proposing to remove the protection of the bike lane and basically not really enhance things for either bicycles or public transport commuters, I think it's contrary to those goals.
I see. So what alternatives would you propose? So instead of a bike lane conversion, what does your group stand for or would fight for?
So, Ezra, I think what's really important, speaking on behalf of the Move as One coalition, we really advocate sustainable transportation in all its forms. So, primarily, this is public transportation, walking, and cycling. We want people not strictly to bicycle, but to have options. So, it's really important for us, number one. We recognize the majority of people using Ayala Avenue use public transportation. So, I think it's really important when you talk about what happens to Ayala Avenue. You're not just talking about the bike lane here, but you need to do something for the commuters so that they don't feel in conflict with the bike lanes. We think number one, the commuters on Ayala Avenue need to have their own dedicated lane for public transport only. That's not going to be congested by private vehicles. So that's number one. You need to provide the public transport option. Number two, you also need to provide the active transport option, which is cycling, so that people have many options and they don't feel forced to use their car to get around. Because as we all know, when people get out and use their car, I think everybody knows on some level that they're contributing to traffic, but then they know it, but no one likes it because the options usually for cycling and public transport sometimes just aren't very good if you already own a car. So if you're Ayala Corporation, I think what you need to be asking yourself, are you really promoting a solution that makes public transport and active transport like cycling, are you making those more attractive? Or are you forcing people to use cars by taking away those options? So I think that's an important thing to consider here.
So the decision of converting those bike lanes have been deferred, not really canceled. So what's your next move after March 6th? Are you going to stage another protest? Are you going to go to the Makati local government to discuss this, as this is a private decision on the roads? So what's your next move for Move as One coalition?
You're very correct to say that it's been deferred until March 6th. However, unfortunately, it seems like Ayala Land is still committed to removing the physical protection of the bike lanes. I think even before March 6th, we will continue to engage with Ayala Land. I think we've already invited them to be part of a technical working group so that we can bring PUV commuters, public transport riders, and cyclists also in the room with them to get to a real solution that will benefit everybody. In addition to speaking with those stakeholders in Ayala Land, we have sent communication also to the Makati City government to let them know that, as partners also of the private sector, of commuters, and of even people who don't necessarily live in Makati but who go to work there, that you really need a solution that highlights sustainable transportation and gives people, like I said, all the options, not just cycling, but also public transport, also walking, and to make sure that those are top choices rather than people bringing their own cars.
All right, thank you for that, Anthony. So do you have any message for anyone who's watching to encourage them to bike more, or to encourage them to try active transport?
I would say that if you're feeling apprehensive about cycling, this is not a it doesn't have to be like a moral coercion. I'm like, no one's forcing anyone to bike, but I think what we want to say here is that bikes and public transportation are allies. We don't want to cyclists are not in conflict with public transportation. In fact, what we want in Move as One Coalition is for public transportation to be a superior option for everybody. And that doesn't have to mean taking away road space from bikers. We want people to have freedom, really, the freedom to walk, the freedom to take public transportation, and the freedom to cycle, rather than forcing people to use their own motor vehicles.
Thank you so much for your insight, Robert Anthony Siy, active transport advocate from a Move as One coalition. Thank you for your time.